Look around. You can find cars like these on AutoTrader, like that car riding your tail. Or if you're tailgating right now, all those cars doubling as kitchens and living rooms are on AutoTrader too. Are you working out and listening to this ad at the same time? Well, multitasking pro, cars like the ones in the gym parking lot are for sale on AutoTrader. New cars, used cars, electric cars, maybe even flying cars. Okay, no flying cars, but as soon as they get invented, they'll be on AutoTrader. Just you wait. AutoTrader.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
You found your person. Now let the Knot help you with everything else. The Knot connects you to the wedding inspo, vendors, venues, and planning tools you need to make your day totally you. Having helped plan 25 million weddings, we've got your back when it comes to every little detail like RSVPs, budgets, and more. Because your wedding comes to life with the connections that matter the most. Get started at theknot.com/audio. The Knot. Let's plan your wedding together.
We've said to NATO, okay, if you go to war, when you need a reserve, we'll provide that. And that means we could be looking at a bill of 40,000 people. Well, the army's only 70,000 people at the moment. So do we think we're genuinely going to be able to deploy more than half of the army? We'd better meet it. Otherwise, NATO's going to look at the UK as if it's not credible.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a show where we try to search for a semblance of order in our mad, 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 mad world. It appears to be a world which has seemed to turn ever and ever more against the experts, against continuity, and a world which is no longer characterized by strong transatlantic trust and coordination. A world where zero-sum transactional thinking is increasingly combined with reversal-prone actions to produce tremendous disorder. So, this leaves us with a question. We're trying to be orderers. Where, amidst all this disorder, where do we go to find this order? Well, one place we're going to try to find it is by speaking to real-world experts in diplomacy, defense, and security, by drawing on our partnership with RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. This partnership will entail a special monthly episode of Disorder, featuring one of RUSI's deep deck of experts in security and defense, where we highlight her or his research and policy work, hoping to generate impactful and engaging content. We'll also feature quarterly exclusive live events in central London at RUSI's Whitehall offices, available only to RUSI members or to paid members of the Ordering the Disorder Substack. The first such event is on March 11th with Arthur Snell and myself and a special RUSI guest to be announced later. You can book this through links in the show notes. So yes, RUSI can help us on the Disorder Pod to order the disorder. Of this, I am sure. But who can help the global orderers who appear to be in disarray? I've long been hoping that the answer is Britain. With the French and German governments teetering, neo-populists in the ascendant in other corners of the EU, with Trudeau stepping down in Canada, there remains a strong case to be made that Keir Starmer and Britain itself, with its stonking center-left continuity majority, could be a major orderer globally. But I haven't seen it, and the proof is in the pudding. So today we are going to look at the current British government's defense and security policy and investigate if Britain can be an anchor in the free world and a major orderer and convener in Western defense and security. To help me probe this question, it's an honor to be joined by Matthew Savill. He is the Director of Military Sciences at RUSI. His team focuses on understanding trends in modern warfare and their impact on military strategy, capabilities, and planning. He spent over 20 years in national security roles in government, starting as an intelligence analyst and later moving on to policy and operations, working in both the MOD and the UK Cabinet Office, and having been on deployments in Iraq, the Middle East, and Afghanistan. Matt, welcome to Disorder.
Good afternoon.
So Matt, it's conventional wisdom that the Starmer administration has not really hit the ground running in its first 7 months, that it's lost popularity quite quickly, and has not in fact implemented the major policy changes that would have increased Britain's global stance. Is this an unfair assessment?
I don't think it's an unfair assessment. I think what is notable from my perspective as somebody who looks at defence policy, military strategy, is that it's probably not their approach on security that is really registering with the public. It is classically the economy and domestic policy on things like migration that is really causing the problem. And that means that people like me are actually talking about issues that don't yet have the kind of cut through with the population that you might think, even with a major war raging in Europe. And that's basically part of the problem.
Now, if we leave the realm of perceptions, what has the current government's approach been to the role of the military?
Well, in many respects, what they are following would be seen as the consensus position. So we've had speeches by John Healey, who's the Defence Secretary, and David Lammy, who's the Foreign Secretary, which could have come straight out of the mouths of any number of ministers in the previous Labour government under Blair or Brown, not wildly dissimilar to what some Conservative ministers would have said on core issues. Ukraine is a good example. We have had absolute continuity of UK policy on Ukraine, which is essentially that we support Ukraine, and they're even using the same figure for the value of UK military support, which covers a range of things, which is around £3 billion a year.
And can I jump in here and say, I love it. As an orderer, one thing that I really believe is your allies need to be able to count on you when you might have a change in democratic government. And I think it's a great thing, and it boosts Britain's global standing that, someone sitting in Kyiv can know, if Boris is my friend and he leaves, I don't have to be terrified that the positionality of the British government is going to be totally different on supporting Ukraine.
Yes, and there has been some criticism of how that has been implemented and the Prime Minister's role. So there has been a bit of criticism that Keir Starmer took so long to go to Kyiv, but other ministers visited within 48 hours of the election, which was how highly they prioritised it. There has been some criticism that the UK hasn't continued to lead international efforts, but there has been a fairly high degree of consensus and support across the board that the UK is not cutting back its support fundamentally. In other senses, what people like Lammy have set out is a classic Britain is globally engaged role, and that means the military has a global responsibility to back up that foreign policy. I mean, where the UK plays this sort of link role between Europe and the US, and we're a P5 member, permanent UN Security Council member, and we see ourselves playing this international role.
Now, I understand why the public views Starmer as just going back to Blairite language and to continuity on foreign policy as being less than exciting. Just like when Biden went back and did stuff that McCain or Clinton or even Obama would have done, the public was like, boring, we wanted it to be different. Is the public maybe not fair in their expectations of what, the correct kind of leadership policies look like?
I'm wary of sweeping generalizations, but I'm about to make one. I don't think that the broad swathe of foreign policy, national security, defense issues has even the same level of traction that it does in the US. And so, you could look over at what you described there with Biden, but of course, they clearly felt the need to do something to address the link with domestic politics. And that is why they came up with their, frankly, somewhat nebulous bumper sticker of foreign policy for the middle classes. If you remember that, there was a feeling that they would have to begin explaining to the US population.
Yeah, but
why
that was very poorly articulated, and the cut through was negligible.
Well, indeed, but they clearly felt a need to do it. What is, honestly striking, it doesn't feel like UK politicians see the need to do the same thing. So you see a general support, public endorsement for UK support to Ukraine that isn't being contaminated by the same kind of debate as in the US. But it's very abstract. And so people don't really have a view on how much we should spend, but they clearly don't prioritize that spending very highly when compared to immigration, the health service, welfare, even business and industry. So I think the issue is it kind of feels like it has to be taken at political cost. If a government wants to devote the attention and change public spending to do something different on foreign policy and defense, it's doing it for relatively little benefit.
I think what we've done now is set the stage, which is that foreign policy and defense policy is absolutely not a top priority for the public, hasn't been a top priority for the Starmer administration. It's not that they've so much failed or made gaffes, but they've had a comms problem. And I just want to point out from a transatlantic perspective, comms problems have real world implications. If you look at Biden, there was a lot of nuanced policy, both on Ukraine and Israel-Palestine, with very bad efforts to communicate them. And the comms problem ended up defeating the sound logic of the actual policy. So now pausing that, that's our kind of overarching superstructure. Let's get into the details. As I said, mega orderers, we're trying to bring on real experts so we can get beyond just generalities and platitudes. I want to talk about specifics. What are the new military capabilities that the MOD is currently trying to bring online for Britain?
Well, where we stand at the moment is that we have this, and this varies across the services. We have a wildly varied equipment program. And that's buying the stuff, but you've got to train people on it. You've got to have the right people, the right infrastructure. So it's not just bits of metal. You have a Royal Navy that has quite a large program of shipbuilding in train, and that's about replacing whole classes of ships and finishing off the last of our new attack submarines, but they've taken years to build. And then the biggie in the background is the renewal of the nuclear deterrent, where we will be upgrading the ballistic missiles, but the big and expensive thing there is a new class of the big ballistic missile submarines that carry those weapons.
And that's absolutely critical. I just want to point out to the listeners that to be a top table major power, you need an independent nuclear deterrent. And you might think, oh, but people never use nuclear. What does it really matter? And I think that you would agree with me, although please push back if you don't. If you want to be a serious P5 country that can have the ability to deter a major adversary, you need your own nuclear deterrent, correct?
The challenge is that where we have ended up in history is that the P5 are the winners of the Second World War, who also all happen to be nuclear powers, who all went nuclear, both as a source of prestige and because they felt that they needed to do it to deter the other people who had nuclear weapons. But it is a big deal, but it's also a massive chunk of the equipment program. So the nuclear enterprise, that's nuclear weapons, but also the submarines that have
Tell us,
propulsion.
What percentage are we speaking of?
We're talking about 40% of the equipment program over the next decade will be going into the nuclear enterprise. It's a huge proportion.
However, if you believe that they prevent the extinction of humanity and the destruction of your country, you might as well pay for them.
Oh, I mean, welcome to the ultimate insurance policy. So it's cheap at the cost for the country, but it's a stress borne by defense. So the Navy's doing all of this stuff. The Air Force is kind of upgrading various aircraft. We're bringing in the F-35, which is shared with Navy squadrons as well. But if you were to look at the services, you would say the Army is the one that has been caught most awkwardly with a mishmash of programs, old armor, old tanks, outdated artillery, plans to upgrade lots of these things, but also to adapt to where we are with modern warfare in a number of cases.
Taking this all holistically, Matthew, do you feel that Britain is putting its money where its mouth is, investing in the right sectors to have an independent deterrent and to be able to act both within NATO and independently in ways that it might need to in the mid-21st century?
I mean, it's yes and no, which is a classic researcher's answer. The UK is still one of the big spenders within NATO, £56 billion a year, and that's 2.3% of GDP at the moment. The challenge is, one, we feel like we don't get a particularly effective return on that.
Now, why is that? Because I'm going to jump back and say, when I was in Iraq in 2003, I remember being in the Green Zone and seeing some British troops, and I chatted with them, and they had talked about how they had done policing in East Timor and in Northern Ireland and in Kosovo, and I was super impressed. And then I met their American counterparts, and they're like, this is the first time I've left the United States. My flight to Kuwait was my first international flight, and I just assumed that the leaner, more elite profile of the British military meant more bang per buck. And I get that 2003 is very, very different than now. But when I've encountered at Catterick and elsewhere briefing British 4 Brigade or whatever, they seem to be a little bit more, in general, elite than American forces. And I have to assume that they get more return and are able to do more stuff.
The problem is that renewal of the big equipment has become increasingly expensive. And frankly, we're not good at getting those projects done in time. So they get stretched out, which means they become more expensive, which means the overall pot of money doesn't get stretched much further.
And would you say that this is like the HS2 problem, that Britain has a procurement problem when it comes to like building a higher speed railroad from Manchester to London, and probably a procurement problem when it comes to upgrading military kit that is different than the US?
I mean, there's been a whole series of different diagnoses of what has been going wrong inside defense procurement over time. And I'm wary of giving the impression that people don't think that American defense industry isn't also hugely inefficient.
Oh, I know that.
The problem is that the UK is, if you like it, whatever the opposite of a sweet spot is at the point where it has eyes for expensive high-end kit, but that it is buying in such small numbers because of that expense that we really struggle to compromise, basically.
I'd like to look at a peer country comparison. And when it comes to global footprint and military spending and exports, Britain has only one peer country, and that's France, because it's a country of similar size population, also a P5 member, also a NATO member, although with a different relationship to NATO, but a similar economy and an independent nuclear deterrent. So would you say that Britain is more inefficient and gets less return on its buck in terms of Navy or Air Force or military spending than France? How is it doing in terms of exporting and upgrading its kit? Please make that comparison for me.
Yes, and I should say that there are some bits of UK defence industry that are springing up that are being very effective and efficient. And for example, the UK drone industry, at the moment, that's largely supplying Ukraine. In the comparison with France, and again, this is an area where real defence industrial experts dig into different explanations. Like broadly speaking, yes, they do somehow seem to be able to maintain larger numbers of personnel and a range of capabilities that should be very expensive on a smaller defence budget. The UK is stretched because we've tried to be America, but smaller, but like nearly as good. France is essentially has tried to similarly be a full spectrum military power, but it has some gaps. There's a reason why we provided support helicopters to them in Africa for several years. But if you look at the big picture, they have their own nuclear deterrent, and they have an air-launched version of that, and they've developed that themselves. They've gone for a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Now, we've got 2, and that means we have more aircraft carrier availability than them, but they've managed to maintain that. They have their own intelligence and surveillance satellite constellations. And again, for years, the UK hasn't bothered with that because we had enormous benefits from effectively buying into the US surveillance network, the Five Eyes Alliance more broadly, with our analytical capability. So how does France maintain largish forces, pretty modern equipment, a nuclear deterrent, satellite constellation, other stuff? And the answer seems to be a much closer relationship with French defense industry, where I think they are fundamentally propping it up, but where also it means that their procurement doesn't take quite as long. Now, there's a capability question, which is their stuff as good? But they certainly look efficient.
So, listeners, please come back to me after the break. Matthew and I are going to discuss, are we in a pre-war era characterized by a darkening global mood? Dun, dun, dun. Okay, we are back with Matthew Savill, the Director of Military Sciences at RUSI. Your team has written a series of RUSI commentaries and papers relevant to the development of the UK's armed forces. You wrote an opening commentary in the summer of 2024 debating the question of whether the UK had hollowed out armed forces. What have you concluded, and why does this matter? Are the UK's forces hollowed out?
Yes, and I deliberately use that language. Partly it's eye-catching, but it's also slightly cowardly because it's basically something that Ben Wallace talked about as the Defence Secretary, his view on where we had got to after years of underinvestment. And the term effectively means you have the appearance of capable forces that can do a lot of things. And I should say that the UK does have a lot of excellent capabilities and a lot of excellent people. But when you scratch beneath the surface, you find that the depth of that capability is hugely variable. So an example would be, we have some excellent missiles or guided weapons that we can launch from our aircraft or drop from our aircraft, but we don't have very many of them. So if we went to war, we would use up lots of those quite quickly. The same is true for our artillery stocks for the army.
And in fact, artillery stocks are the huge problem throughout all of Europe, which is that North Korea can produce more artillery in a few months than Europe can produce in a year, and hence our allies, the Ukrainians, run out of their artillery and they have to husband it, while the Russians are just infinitely supplied and they just use it destroying civilian infrastructure and randomly killing civilians in Ukraine. And if we had more artillery, we could deter them more.
And across the forces, the combat bit of your force is usually a relatively small proportion. So in an army formation, it might be 25 to 30% of it actually does the fighting. A relatively small number of people in the RAF are pilots and fly jets. They are enabled by a range of intelligence capabilities or logistics, things that carry stores around or refuel you. And when you look across the forces, in lots of cases, we don't actually have enough of these logistics or enablers to deploy all of the combat bits. And so the problem is that we're quite small and we don't have enough to sustain us in a proper major war. So we could hit hard, but you might say we've got a glass chin.
Pivoting back to this kind of overall mood, you wrote in this opening commentary, which I'm going to be featuring in the Substack and the show notes. And really, dear listeners, RUSI has lots of great outputs. And you might think, oh, these are dry think tank reports. I don't need to click on them. Not the case. I'm going to put some quotes in the Substack because Matthew is a witty and engaging writer. And he's written, we have been told that we live in a pre-war era characterized by a darkening global mood, conflict and competition, and the erosion of the so-called global order. And now I'm going to end the quote with a slight aside. Are we the same person? Are you writing like using my terminology? Back to the quote. And with a requirement to defend UK interests by force if necessary. Are we in a pre-war world? What would that war be? And is Britain really preparing for this, World War III or AI or drone war scenario?
I think it was Grant Shapps who might have said that. I think that's a flourish of rhetoric as an attempt to try and bring home the possibility that we could be called upon to do something more intensive if things don't go well. What we're trying to do is not fight that future war because we have deterred the potential aggressor, be they, Russia in terms of proximity, or maybe Iran or China if you're trying to think of other scenarios. So if I were being cynical, and I frequently am, I think that was a bit of rhetoric because people try and grab back to historical analogies. And so they basically shout, it's the 1930s, it's 1938, wake up. And the problem is that what you do there is you end up in a slightly navel-gazing discussion around like, oh, well, the analogy doesn't quite match or whatever. But what should come out of that use of are we in a pre-war period is we are at a time when it is realistic that within the next few years we could see a major country clash that is very similar to Russia and Ukraine in terms of scale. And that's because things might get worse in Europe, the Middle East remains unstable, and China got designs on Taiwan. And so the idea that we can just stay back and potter along in terms of normal views of maintaining stability is that's for the birds.
That was an excellent overview, and I agree. You've got to preemptively order. Even if getting prepared is just to deter that major war from happening, you've got to be prepared as if a major confrontation with Russia or China directly with the EU, Britain, and the US is about to happen. That's the only way to deter it from happening. So couldn't be more clear. And I think you need to be coordinating with your allies about how you're going to respond in that situation. In other words, it's not just good enough for the US to have a plan about like what we're going to do with Taiwan. We need better coordination with the UK and the EU. Now, let's come back to this issue of 2.5% of UK GDP on defense spending. We heard it in the run-up to the July 4, 2024 election, 2.5%. We commit to 2.5%. And then there's the Trump threat. All NATO members have to spend over 2%. And, Britain wants to be in his good graces and spend 2.5%. And they also want to show that they're a leader. What I'm asking you here is, do you get a lot more bang for your buck with that last 0.5%? Does it need to be 3%? Where should Britain really be in terms of spending on defense?
Right, brilliantly mealy-mouthed answer from me coming up, which is like, it depends. So 2%, any percent of GDP, it's a wholly semi-arbitrary political target about commitment. So it changes over time. We picked 2% previously at the Wales summit in 2014 before Trump was even on the scene because NATO countries were spending less than that. And so we needed something to bring everybody up. During the Cold War, I think the UK, a reasonable high point, it's actually just after the Falklands, I think it was 4 to 5%. You could ask, the UK spends £56 billion on defence. Is that enough? And the answer is, well, it should be if we were any good at spending.
Okay, so that's your answer. And I want to highlight this, is that the £56 billion could be stretched with efficiencies and better planning to do the job.
But, well, I think this is where the answer is like, not anymore. So where we are at the moment is the money that we're spending is already 2.3% of our GDP. The increase up to 2.5 is therefore, it's a few £billion a year, and that adds up over time. But that is basically required to stand still. So there is an argument that says if you want the armed forces to even look like they do at the moment for the next few years, you need to spend maybe 6, 7, 8 billion more a year to keep going.
But what about increasing capacity, which is more important to deal with the mid-21st century challenges? What are the lessons of drone warfare and entrenchment that's happening in Ukraine for how Britain rebuilds its military? What can Britain do to handle the kind of capacities that you might need in the mid-21st century?
So a lot of this is, and I am with those, including of my team, who say that drone warfare is a big evolution, but it is not a revolution, is that you need way more and at all different levels, for example. So we still need artillery, probably buy more, and bring in surveillance drones and strike drones that you can have at all levels of your forces, fundamentally. We need to think about complementing our combat aircraft with these kind of drones that fly as part of a squadron, might be controlled by it, they might have autonomy. Our big challenge there is that we're also spending billions on a new crewed aircraft. Should we actually be redirecting that money into more drones because you could get more for a single combat aircraft? The Navy is looking at, can we bring in more autonomous systems to do things like mine hunting? Or could you complement your big ships with a kind of a flotilla of small uncrewed ships that are all around it for defensive purposes? This is the really difficult bet that the UK is going to have to make with this quite tight finances, which is, where do we decide to retire existing equipment and rapidly move to more autonomy in other systems?
The time has come to order the disorder. Matthew, please help order the chaos that is out there with me. I clearly think it's important for Britain to have fully sovereign, independent, and deployable military capacities, like, for example, a carrier group or an expeditionary force. And you've written about this. You're an expert in this domain. I'm merely a pundit. One, is it important? How much does it cost? How would you sell to the British public why it's worth spending on having these sovereign, independent, and deployable capacities? And what does Britain need to do to get there, to be able to do it in a mid-21st century world where maybe the Americans are not going to deploy to deal with the Houthis' threats to Red Sea shipping?
I mean, the reason why it's worth doing it is because it gives you choices that you don't have otherwise. And I think this is where the UK is going to need to pick some winners or some key capabilities and ensure that it can do them properly. In too many cases, what we've actually done is developed a capability and left ourselves with a significant dependence on someone else. The Air Force at the moment, it's developing a missile very expensively because it's only buying it in small numbers, but the Air Force doesn't really have the ability to suppress enemy air defenses at the moment. So enemy radars and ground-based missiles, they threaten your aircraft. And what you normally try and do is destroy those systems before you then go and bomb something or attack enemy ground forces. Well, at the moment, we would be reliant upon the American Air Force to do that.
Is there a way, though, to work with the EU to compensate for this dependence on America?
I mean, increasingly, yes. So other European countries, other European NATO members are buying these systems in, and RUSI is currently writing about where might various European air forces be valuable in specializing. But then what you've got to do is, as a nation, take a decision, well, we won't do that, you do that. But as a coherent capability, we should be looking at what can we do well and make sure we can do it.
I'd like to see Britain having these sovereign, independent, deployable capabilities. But then there's the pull in the other direction, which is to specialize into some things that you can then coordinate with your European allies and work together. And how would you say that Starmer's current approach comes down on this question?
So it's not clear to me, but there are some hints in the way that they're talking. So first of all, they have put a big priority on what they say NATO first, but not NATO only. And the big thing that is different from the last government is they are doing this European reset, as they call it, but basically saying we need to get closer to Europe. And I think that's probably sensible in the wake of the problems that we are going to have in working with the US. But it means that Europe has really got to step up. Otherwise, all you're doing is saying, let's coordinate better with a bunch of other people who are also going to prevaricate and undersell themselves. So NATO first means that we are far more likely to be guided by the requirements and the commitments, the requirements set by NATO and the commitments we've given to them. The problem there is that we might not be actually up to meeting all of those commitments. The best example is we've said to NATO, okay, if you go to war, when you need a reserve, we'll provide that. And that means we could be looking at a bill of 40,000 people. Let's say this is all finger in the air maths. Well, the army is only 70,000 people at the moment. So do we think we're genuinely going to be able to deploy more than half of the army? But I mean, that's a target that we've set ourselves. So we'd better meet it. Otherwise, NATO's going to look at the UK as if it's not credible.
Many listeners will remember that we had Jonathan Powell on episode 11 of this podcast, and we discussed with him the psychology of negotiations. He's someone I worked with on Libya when he was special envoy, and he's someone that I really greatly respect. So when Starmer picked him as the new national security advisor, I was happy. I haven't been thrilled with all of Starmer's appointments. This was one that I thought, wow, it's a wise choice. I read a RUSI commentary that you wrote about this selection. We're going to have it in the show notes in the Substack. And it made me ask a whole range of questions, which is that, maybe there are some bureaucratic mistakes here. Why was Powell's appointment not made in the cabinet office, but rather as a SPAD in number 10? What are the potential drawbacks of this? Could there be advantages? That confuses me.
I mean, the answer to this is slightly nerdy and equally complicated, but if I try and sort of lay it out in broad brushstrokes, the positives of the appointment are that he is somebody who has been picked by the Prime Minister because he's got this great background, because he's a big potentially political player. That suggests that he will have a lot of authority in him representing Starmer's views. He's been leading on the Chagos negotiations previously. And so, if you're looking to say, is the NSA going to be an important player in government? Well, they went out and they headhunted someone, basically. So that's a positive. What are the potential drawbacks? It basically creates a really complicated situation because he's not a civil servant. He's a political appointee. And that changes how he can actually tell people in the cabinet office what to do. He's physically in a different place. So when he was announced...
But why? Why can't he just be a civil servant in the cabinet office? I don't get that.
This is the unknown of, well, why have they done it this way? And it's very unclear to the outsider as to why he's been kind of plucked in. And the subtext to this, the sort of the gossipy side of the story, is that the previous government had already appointed somebody, the previous vice chief of the defence staff, to be the new national security advisor. And that appointment was switched off. And so there's something going on in the background here that's not really obvious to us external observers that complicates all of this.
And what are the drawbacks of this?
The big drawback is that because of the rules that govern how special advisors operate, he can't actually be responsible for budgets and spending.
That's a huge mistake. It creates more bureaucratic coordination that's not needed.
Exactly. So you've got to send those responsibilities to somebody else.
Oh, God, depressing. So given this and these struggles, do you think Powell can help order the disorder? And if you were in an elevator with him, it's going to be 30 seconds. What's the one piece of advice you'd give him?
He has to help the government decide what its proper priorities are. The UK system over the past 25 years has basically kept on saying, this is our security or defence priority, and then it changes its mind. And that really messes with programmes, it messes with policy, basically some discipline and not trying to be all things to all people.
I'm wondering, in fact, if Powell might be able to restore British convening power over issues like Colombia, the Pacific, or what's called the BIAT, the British Indian Ocean Territory, and things like Libya. And these are all areas where he's conducted major mediations previously. I would like to see him say, you know what, I'm not only going to do this NSA stuff, we're going to use Britain as a major convening power, leveraging my personal experience in complex international mediation negotiations. I don't know if it's going to happen, but that's what I'd like to say.
I'm going to not push back, but I'm going to give the non-Foreign Office approved answer. That's a lovely, comfortable answer for how the UK sees itself. We link people, we convene people, right? We are now living in a world where cold, hard power is being exercised, and the US is not talking about, frankly, values. It's talking about US interests, and it's willing to trample its own allies to get at them. And if the UK wants to convene, it needs to bring something to the party. We've got to bring actual influence, or actual military capability or an actual clever diplomatic insight into solving a problem, if we just see ourselves as essentially a place to have nice conversations at Lancaster House, then all we're going to do is be standing still whilst China and Russia are using hard power to achieve their objectives.
Very well put. Obviously, hard power and the ability to use leverage is critical to convene and get stuff done. So you need a balance of both. Now, to do and to cultivate that hard power, what of AI? Can Britain be a medium plus AI military power in a way that will help it have more hard power leverage to come to those conversations?
Yes, but I don't think we are setting ourselves up to do it at the moment. When you talk to people who have real insight into artificial intelligence developments, they will tell you that we are simply not prepared for the scale of change that is happening. So the MOD is experimenting with artificial intelligence, but the kind of profound changes that could hit us in the next 18 months are just not yet being factored into our thinking. What do I mean by that? I don't just mean using artificial intelligence on weapons to support the identification of targets or even intelligence analysis, although frankly we are still lagging on both of those. But the kind of profound use of artificial intelligence to support making decisions and design strategies where the tech evangelists, I mean, maybe they're exaggerating, but they will tell you that we are not that far off the point where artificial intelligence tools will be able to design complex strategies incredibly rapidly, and we will be faced with challenges of, well, do we accept the judgment of essentially a black box that we don't fully understand, but it's thinking 5 steps ahead? And I think we have some people who are specializing in this technology in this country, and the US certainly does, but we are still playing around the edges, and other people are either implementing this technology or are beginning to grapple with or have simply bypassed the kind of the ethical and moral debates that we will probably spend ages discussing.
Matthew, that was a critical point about AI and the ways that AI can change how government itself functions, how government makes plans, how government allocates NHS beds. This is exactly what we spoke about with Mark Warner in episode 61 that we're going to put a link to the show notes. He postulates that AI can help us order the disorder, and that in Britain in specific, AI can play a unique role in fixing British public services, and that a Starmer-led Britain can become an AI superpower in using AI to allocate finite resources. To finally order the disorder with me, 2 last questions. If you had one specific policy suggestions to fix the problems that your research raises, what would it be? And 2, if you could create a global ordering institution, not something within Britain, but a global institution that would deal with the security challenges that interests you, not just NATO, what would that be?
If it were to come down to sort of my one suggestion, in spite of all the time that I've spent talking about sexy kit and aircraft carriers, there is a very real and pressing need for the UK to shore up its people. And therefore, we need to invest in infrastructure, training, education, knowledge and skills, because otherwise we're not actually going to be able to make all of those other good decisions, and we won't have anybody to crew or run the necessary equipment and capability. So it should be a real priority for defense in particular. In terms of a global organizing institution, I'll be honest, I don't think it exists. It's not the UN, and I don't think it can exist. I think this is the natural disorder in the human condition. And the best that we can do is continue to try and play a constructive role in whatever the new global order looks like, and nudge it in a certain direction, and focus on the alliances and partnerships that we have and making them work and valuable. We haven't talked a lot about the Trump effect, and I think that will be very destabilizing for NATO and a lot of people who just won't be able to process an interests-only and transactional approach looks like with the US. But things like NATO And we've built up smaller alliances like the Joint Expeditionary Force, which this government does not appear to be prioritizing, all offer a kind of mutual value if people actually invest time and resources in them.
Yes, Matt, you've hit at the profound philosophical struggles of our disordered world. A lot of that disorder is within us. Humans don't coordinate well with each other at times. They have difficulty putting longer-term interests ahead of shorter-term ones. And the more complicated a situation becomes, the less they're capable of coordinating and planning ahead. That said, I still think that Britain can be important in ordering the disorder. It can use hard power capabilities to give it a greater say on the world stage. And I have hope for the Starmer government's ability to be an ordering player on the international stage. Thank you for discussing and unpacking all these complex issues with us today.
My pleasure.
Wow, it was fun to do our first RUSI featured mega ordering expert on the Disorder Pod. I hope you enjoyed it and that you will be tuning in every month when we have these special RUSI disorder episodes. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the mega orderer-in-chief, George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. Follow the link in the Substack to find out how to come to the live event on March 11th in Whitehall. And please follow the links in the show notes in the Substack to find out more about Matthew Savill's excellent RUSI commentaries and articles that I mentioned. Amidst all these complexities, I am wishing you a very orderly week, and that I hope you agree with me that Britain can be a mega orderer. Bye for now.